Fog crept along the forgotten road like a living thing, curling around the wheels of the car as if trying to drag it back from where it came. The Ashford house rose at the end of the narrow gravel path, its silhouette jagged and wrong against the dying crimson of the sky. Even in the fading light, the windows looked less like glass and more like hollow eyes, empty, starving, waiting. Locals still refused to speak of the family except in murmurs, and even then only when daylight washed every corner of the room. They said the house did not simply stand there, it watched. It remembered. And it hungered. The first disappearance was something the town tried to forget, though the land itself seemed determined to remember. It happened in late autumn, when the hills turned the color of old blood and the wind carried a sharpness that scraped across the skin. The traveler was young, barely in his mid-20s, and the sort of person who believed that legends were just stories, nothing more than local superstition woven out of boredom and old fears. He had been passing through the region on a photography road trip, fascinated by decaying architecture and forgotten places. When he heard about the Ashford house from a gas station attendant who warned him with a shake of the head and a muttered, "You don't want to go up that way," curiosity took root where caution should have. He ignored every warning sign the way only someone who feels untouchable can. He was last seen buying a pack of batteries for his camera and asking for directions to the gravel road that twisted toward the old estate. The attendant pointed him the right way but refused to meet his eyes, as though helping him was an act of betrayal against something unseen. The traveler, amused by the fear in the man's voice, jotted a few notes in his pocket journal, observations about the locals, their strange unease, their reluctance even to speak the name Ashford. He wrote that he wanted to catch the house at sunset, when the long shadows would make the decaying structure look even more dramatic through his lens. He wrote that the fog rolling off the hills would make the perfect shot. Then he closed his notebook and drove off, leaving behind the last person who would ever see him alive. His car was found a week later, half hidden by overgrown brush as though the forest itself had dragged it off the road and tried to swallow it. The keys were still in the ignition. The door on the driver's side hung open like an abandoned thought. There was no sign of a struggle, at least not one the sheriff could identify, but the seat was pushed back farther than seemed natural, as if the driver had leapt out in a hurry or been yanked with sudden force. In the passenger seat was his camera, the lens cracked. The memory card was missing. The search began with confidence, the kind that comes from believing in logical explanations, but it didn't take long before that confidence eroded. The woods around the Ashford property were dense in uninviting ways, with paths that led nowhere and sudden drops concealed beneath fallen leaves. Volunteers combed through the forest for hours, calling his name into the gloom, each echo returning thinner and weaker than the one before. The fog that day was strange, so dense it felt like a wall, muffling sounds and swallowing voices until they vanished mid-shout. Some said it moved with purpose, shifting in slow, deliberate waves as though reacting to every step. On the second day of searching, an officer found a torn satchel dangling from a low branch, as if someone had carefully placed it there. Inside was a single page from the traveler's journal, ripped unevenly along the spine. The writing was frantic, the pen strokes harsh enough to dent the paper. He had scribbled something about hearing whispers just beyond the tree line, voices layered over each other like overlapping breaths. He wrote of feeling watched, of something pacing him just out of sight. The last line was slanted downward, as though written in a rush, the house. "I think it knows I'm here." The search expanded around the estate, but no one dared enter the house itself, not even the sheriff. It was not an official rule, it was simply understood. The porch sagged under its own weight, the windows were half shattered, and the door hung slightly ajar even when no wind touched it. But it was not the appearance that kept them out. It was the feeling that pressed against anyone who stepped too close, a sensation like standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing that if you leaned forward even slightly, something would push you the rest of the way. The volunteers circled the house, never crossing its threshold, the air thick with unspoken agreement. As the days stretched on with no more clues found, the community began to shift from hope to dread. Some whispered that the traveler must have fallen into one of the old mine shafts littering the hills. Others insisted he had run off, overwhelmed by the isolation of the mountains. But no one who had seen the house, not in years, believed either explanation fully. There was a quiet understanding that whatever happened to him had not been the result of an accident or a panicked flight. It had been deliberate. Intentional. On the 5th day, the sheriff called off the search. He made a brief statement about continuing investigations, but his voice lacked conviction and his eyes betrayed the resignation of a man who knew the truth was buried somewhere he dared not look. The disappearance was filed away, another unsolved mystery in a region thick with them. But as winter crawled in and snow buried the last signs of the traveler's presence, some locals claimed they began hearing something unusual when driving past the Ashford Road late at night. A soft echo in the woods. A faint whisper carried by the wind. Something like a voice calling out, always distant, always fading, always sounding as though it belonged to someone desperately trying to find their way back. The torn page from his journal was kept locked in a drawer at the sheriff's office, though no one spoke of it again. It was the only real piece of evidence, and yet it raised more questions than it answered. The handwriting seemed to change halfway through the message, slanting into a style that didn't match the earlier entries. The ink looked darker, almost wet, even after days exposed to the elements. And at the very bottom, barely visible unless someone tilted the page just right, were faint indentations, scratches, shallow but deliberate, shaped like tiny letters repeating a single word over and over, as though something else had written alongside him in the final moments before he vanished into the woods that surrounded the Ashford house. The diary was found on a rain-soaked morning in early spring, at a time when the land around the Ashford Estate seemed more restless than usual. The soil had begun to shift again, as it often did after days of heavy storms, revealing old stones, rusted tools, and fragments of the past that were better left buried. It was a pair of hikers who first spotted the corner of the book sticking out from beneath a twisted root near the forest's edge. They assumed it was trash, a soggy, swollen piece of someone's discarded belongings, but the leather was too old and too cracked to belong to anything modern. One of them knelt down, brushing away the wet earth until the full shape of the diary emerged, its once deep brown cover now washed pale by decades of neglect. The hikers didn't open it. Something about it felt wrong, as though the moment their fingers touched the surface, a chill would crawl up their arms. They wrapped it in a jacket and took it straight to the sheriff's office, eager to be done with it. The sheriff recognized the family name embossed faintly on the inner flap before he even cracked the book open, Ashford. The letters were almost gone, worn thin like a whispered secret, but they were unmistakable. For a long moment he simply held the diary, weighing it in his hands, unsure if he wanted to know what waited inside its warped pages. It had been years since anyone had recovered something connected to the family, and even then, everything that surfaced only added fog to a story already too clouded to understand. Still, he opened it. The first pages were ruined, soaked through until the ink had bled into indistinguishable clouds of blue and black. The edges crumbled when touched. But deeper in the diary, beyond the water damage, the words remained intact, written in a delicate, hurried script that belonged to someone young, someone frightened, someone who had seen more than any child should. The entries were dated late winter of a year that matched the final known months of the eldest Ashford daughter's life. Her name had been Eleanor, though the town rarely spoke it anymore. Some said saying it aloud brought bad luck. Others said it summoned things that were better forgotten. The sheriff read the first legible entry, his breath slow and uneasy. Eleanor wrote about the noises she heard in the walls at night, soft scratching at first, like mice seeking warmth, but growing louder as the days passed. She described how the house seemed to shift around her, doors that stuck one morning swung freely the next, and the portrait in the upstairs hallway appeared to tilt slightly each time she walked by. Her parents dismissed her concerns as childish imagination, but Eleanor insisted something inside the house was awake and watching her. The further he read, the more erratic the handwriting became. The letters slanted, crowded together, sometimes breaking apart entirely as though her hand trembled while writing. Eleanor wrote of hearing someone breathe behind her while she studied in the parlor, only to turn and find the room empty. She wrote of shadows stretching too far across the floor, bending around corners where no light touched. And then came the sketches, dozens of them, pressed between the pages with frantic pressure. They were crude, drawn in charcoal that had smeared over time, but clear enough to make the sheriff's stomach knot. Many showed the inside of the house, the staircase, the long upstairs hall, the attic entrance. But in each drawing, there were figures, tall, undefined forms lurking in corners, their limbs elongated, their heads featureless except for the suggestion of hollow eye sockets. The more drawings he flipped through, the more those figures seemed to shift positions, appearing closer and closer to the young girl's own outline, as though inching toward her with each new sketch. Some were dated only days apart, yet the shadows in the images had multiplied, surrounding her from every direction. One page stood out among the rest. It was dated the week before Eleanor's recorded death and carried the deepest indentations, the charcoal nearly tearing through the paper. She had drawn her own room, the bed neatly made, the window latched, the wardrobe slightly ajar. But this time, the figure in the drawing was not in the corner or behind the door. It was standing at the foot of her bed, its head bowed low, facing her, as though waiting for permission to step closer. Eleanor's words on that page were brief, written in a jagged script that slanted wildly down the margin. She wrote that the whispers had become full voices now, overlapping and murmuring her name in the dark. She said she could no longer tell which sounds were coming from the house and which were inside her own mind. She wrote that something had been promised long before she was born, something her parents refused to speak of, something she feared would soon be claimed. The final entry was barely legible. The ink was smeared, as if her hand had slipped or someone had grabbed the page before it dried. She wrote that the house would not let her sleep anymore. That every time she closed her eyes, she felt breath on her face. That she had woken the previous night to find her bedroom door wide open, even though she remembered locking it herself. At the bottom of the page were 4 words so faint the sheriff had to hold the diary near the window to read them: "It knows I'm alone." The sheriff snapped the book shut, his pulse heavy in his throat. Even now, decades after the Ashfords vanished, the air in the room seemed to tighten around him, as though the diary carried more than words and charcoal. It felt like a warning whispered across time, a voice reaching out from the past to anyone foolish enough to open the book and read what a terrified girl had tried to leave behind. The discovery of the sealed room happened not during an investigation, but by accident, an unsettling coincidence that no one in town wanted to examine too closely. It was late summer, and the estate had been abandoned for decades, left to rot under the weight of its own history. Rain had gnawed through the roof, ivy had consumed the outer walls, and the floors groaned with the weariness of something that had been awake far too long. A small crew had come to survey the property after a new land developer expressed interest in buying the plot. Most of the workers were locals, men who had grown up hearing enough stories about the Ashford family to keep them uneasy the entire drive up the old gravel road. They moved quickly, keeping their voices low, as though afraid the house might be listening. Inside, dust floated in the air like disturbed ash, swirling in patterns that felt too intentional. They began with the first floor, cataloguing the collapsing beams, the mold-blackened wallpaper, and the strange cold pockets that persisted no matter how the sun baked the roof. It was when they reached the West Wing library that the first man felt it, a faint draft brushing the back of his neck, cool and deliberate, though no window was open and the air outside was still. He ignored it at first, focusing instead on the rotted shelves and the piles of books that had melted into unrecognizable lumps of paper. But the draft came again, stronger this time, slipping through a thin crack between the bookshelves and brushing his cheek like breath. He called the others over, pointing out the way the shelf seemed slightly misaligned compared to the others. At first glance, it looked like any other in the library, tall, water-stained, heavy with decades of dust, but when one of the workers tugged gently at the edge, the entire frame shifted a fraction of an inch. The sound that followed was soft, more felt than heard, like the exhale of something waking up. 2 of the men exchanged uneasy glances. They considered leaving it alone, but curiosity, or something that felt uncomfortably like compulsion, pulled them forward. With a combined effort, they pushed the bookshelf, and it groaned open, revealing a narrow gap of pure blackness behind it. The smell drifted out first, cold and metallic, like old iron and damp stone. Flashlights shook as the men aimed their beams into the void. The narrow passage extended only a few feet before ending at a heavy wooden door, its surface cracked and warped but still solid. Strange symbols were carved along the edges, deep gouges that didn't resemble any language but looked deliberate, as if etched by someone desperate to keep something inside. The lock was rusted, its metal flaking away like dead skin. After a few hesitant attempts, they managed to pry it open. The door swung inward with a reluctant groan. The moment it did, an unnatural chill seeped into the room, crawling across the floor like fog. Their lights flickered before stabilizing, illuminating a small chamber no larger than a storage closet. Yet the walls were lined with chains bolted into the stone, each one ending in an iron shackle that looked worn from use. The floor was stained in dark, uneven patches that hadn't faded with time, though no one wanted to imagine what had left them. There were grooves carved into the floorboards too, deep, jagged, and uneven, as though someone had clawed at the wood until their fingers broke. One worker crouched to inspect the nearest chain and nearly dropped his flashlight when he saw it. A photograph lay half buried beneath dust near the far wall. Carefully, he picked it up. The edges were curled, the surface warped from moisture, but the image was still clear enough to see. It was a family portrait, the Ashfords, dressed in formal clothing, standing stiffly in front of the house in its younger days. But there was something wrong. Everyone who had ever seen the public records knew the Ashfords had 4 children. The photograph showed 6. The 2 extra figures were children, though their faces were blurred, as if the camera had failed to capture them properly, or as if something had deliberately distorted their features. Their bodies appeared too thin, their posture stiff and unnatural, and they stood slightly apart from the rest of the family, as though they did not belong. Behind them loomed the faint outline of a tall, shadowy shape, almost invisible at first glance, but becoming clearer the longer one stared. It had no defined edges, no clear form, yet its presence was unmistakable, stretching over the family like a dark canopy. One of the men swore he saw the shadow shift as he tilted the photo, as though reacting to the light. He dropped it immediately, and it fluttered to the floor face down. None of the workers wanted to remain in the room after that. The air had grown thick, hard to breathe, carrying a low vibration that seemed to hum beneath the skin. They backed out quickly, pulling the bookshelf shut behind them. The click of the shelf returning to its place echoed through the house like a final punctuation, but instead of offering relief, the sound made the rooms feel heavier, more suffocating, as if something had just been sealed back inside. Later that afternoon, when the crew regrouped outside, one of the men asked the sheriff, quietly, away from the others, whether he'd ever heard rumors of additional Ashford children. The sheriff's expression tightened, but he said nothing. He only stared at the house, his jaw clenched, his eyes reflecting something between fear and recognition. The workers left early that day, each refusing to walk through the West Wing again. None of them returned the following morning. The developer withdrew his offer. The sealed room remained undisturbed, hidden behind its bookshelf once more, but the men who found it spoke of a strange sensation that lingered long after they left the property, as though something had followed them to the tree line, watching from behind the windows, waiting for them to look back. The night of voices became the turning point for many in town, the moment when whispered superstition hardened into something closer to belief, though no one wanted to admit it aloud. It began just after dusk when the last orange streaks of sunlight slipped behind the ridge and left the valley in an unnaturally swift darkness. Even the cicadas, usually loud enough to drown out one's thoughts, fell silent that night as though nature itself refused to intrude on whatever was about to unfold. The fog that crept down from the hills seemed heavier, clinging to the branches and curling around the houses like pale fingers. People felt it in their chests before they heard anything, a tightness, a pressure, a subtle shift in the air that made the night feel swollen with anticipation. The first report came from an elderly widow who lived alone near the base of the old Ashford Road. She said she had been dozing in her rocking chair, the windows cracked open to let in the cool evening breeze, when she heard voices drifting through the trees. At first, she thought it was a group of hikers or teenagers wandering the woods, but the words didn't sound like any conversation she could recognize. They were layered, soft, overlapping whispers spoken too quickly and quietly to distinguish, yet unmistakably human. The sound grew clearer, closer, until it seemed to slip through the walls of her home and settle directly behind her chair. When she turned, of course, nothing was there. Yet the whispers continued, wrapping around her like a cold mist, repeating a fragmented pattern, like someone reciting a phrase she once knew but could no longer remember. She wasn't the only one. On the other side of town, a father searching the shed for a misplaced tool froze mid-step when he heard voices rising from the trees behind his property. They were faint but persistent, like someone murmuring his name through clenched teeth. He stepped outside, expecting to find trespassers or perhaps the neighbor's children, but the yard was empty. The whispers grew louder, slipping between the branches, bouncing off the empty shed, almost rhythmic now. He reached for his phone to call the sheriff, but the moment he touched it, the voices shifted into something louder, a single, disembodied breath against his ear. He dropped the phone, stumbled back into the house, and locked the doors behind him. Calls began to flood the sheriff's office one after another. Some described hearing their names whispered from the direction of the woods. Others claimed the voices came from inside their own homes, through vents, under floorboards, from behind walls. A woman who lived on the outskirts insisted she heard a man speaking clearly from her basement, describing events from her childhood that only she and her long-dead father knew. Another resident reported that her toddler woke screaming, pointing at the closet door, saying someone was talking from inside the dark. When she approached the closet herself, she heard nothing but a faint rasp, like someone exhaling in amusement. The sheriff, already familiar with the rumors surrounding the Ashford Estate, reluctantly gathered a few deputies to investigate the road leading up to the property. As they drove closer, the radios in their vehicles began to crackle, first with static, then with what sounded like breath. Soft, slow, steady. Then a voice emerged through the interference, thin, layered, impossible to trace. It spoke one of their names. The deputies exchanged uneasy glances. The sheriff ordered them to keep going. As they neared the tree line marking the entrance to the Ashford land, the fog thickened until their headlights illuminated only swirling grey. They stopped the vehicles and stepped out cautiously, the forest looming silent around them. The moment the car doors shut, the voices began again, quiet at first, like whispers carried on a breeze. Then louder, more insistent, coming from every direction at once. The sheriff shone his flashlight toward the trees. The beam wavered. The voices grew sharper, repeating something now, 3 or 4 syllables looping in a pattern that made the deputy's skin crawl. One officer clamped his hands over his ears despite knowing the sound wasn't external. Another stepped back, nearly stumbling, insisting the voice he heard belonged to his brother who had died in a mining accident years before. He swore he heard him calling for help from somewhere deep in the woods. Then the whispering shifted abruptly. The overlapping murmurs converged into a single phrase, spoken in perfect unison, cold and hollow, "You should not have come." The trees rustled though no wind blew. The fog pulsed, thickening as though something massive moved behind it. A low vibration hummed beneath their feet, rattling loose stones on the ground. The sheriff, heart pounding, ordered a retreat. They climbed back into the vehicles, but even inside, the voices didn't stop. They filled the entire cabin like a rising tide, echoing from every surface. One deputy began to scream. Another tried to radio for help, but the device only emitted a faint, rasping laughter. It wasn't until they reached the main road that the voices finally faded, dissolving into the night air as though they had never existed. By morning, the town buzzed with fear, though most people avoided acknowledging it directly. They whispered instead about how the Ashford house had always been wrong, always awake, and how the voices that night had sounded almost familiar, almost intimate, as if whatever spoke had known each listener personally. Some believed the voices were warnings. Others believed they were invitations. A few feared they were claims, unseen hands reaching across the valley, reminding the town that the Ashford legacy had never truly died, that something in those woods still breathed, still watched, still whispered, waiting for someone to listen. The final tragedy that sealed the Ashford Estate's reputation in the town's collective memory came during the last investigation ever attempted by local authorities. By then, the land had been abandoned for decades, a scar on the valley that no amount of time could heal. Rumors had piled on top of each other like sediment: unnamed children, missing travelers, the diary filled with frantic sketches, the sealed room behind the bookshelf, the night when voices slithered through every home in the valley. People said the house had grown impatient. That it wanted something again. That it had been waiting. When a young deputy volunteered to follow up on the rising disturbances, most believed he was either brave beyond reason or simply too new to understand what the older generations never dared say out loud. His name was Deputy Mark Hanlon, and at 27, he still carried the kind of confidence others mistook for naivety. Mark wasn't from the valley. He had transferred only months earlier, unaware that the name Ashford was invoked with the same restrained dread as a curse. When the reports of whispers, unexplained shadows, and door knocking in empty houses escalated, he didn't shrug them off like his seasoned counterparts. He believed the people were frightened, yes, but fear alone didn't create such consistent patterns. So he requested permission to inspect the estate one last time, hoping to bring closure and put an end to what he saw as collective anxiety fueled by local folklore. The sheriff tried to discourage him, offering vague warnings, but Mark insisted, saying the house could not hurt him if he kept his wits. His conviction unsettled the sheriff more than any ghost story ever had. On the morning of the investigation, Mark set out alone because no one else would accompany him. The sun shone weakly through thick clouds, offering little warmth. The gravel road wound through claw-like branches that arched overhead as though trying to keep the sky from reaching him. He parked near the collapsed gate, grabbed his flashlight and recorder, and walked up the path. As he approached the house, he paused, struck by the unsettling stillness that surrounded it. No birds. No rustling leaves. Even the wind seemed careful not to pass too near. The house towered before him, leaning, broken, yet undeniably looming with a presence that felt almost alert. Its windows were dark caverns, and its roof sagged as if weighed down by the years it had spent watching. He began his inspection in the foyer, the smell of rot clinging to the air like a damp shroud. Floorboards groaned under his boots. He spoke into his recorder, his voice firm at first as he documented the state of the interior. But as he entered the deeper halls, that confidence began to chip away. Every room had a strange wrongness to it, furniture positioned slightly off-center, wallpaper peeling in unnatural patterns, shadows that refused to behave like normal shadows. Mark paused several times, checking behind him whenever he felt the faint tingling on the back of his neck. He tried to dismiss it as unease, but unease didn't follow a man room to room like a patient observer. He reached the west wing at last, the place where the sealed room had once been found. The bookshelf still stood against the wall, though something about it seemed subtly changed, as though it had shifted an inch or two while no one was looking. Dust blanketed the shelves, but Mark saw faint drag marks across the floor leading directly to it. He crouched down, fingers brushing the path, noticing how the dust pattern widened as it neared the shelf. As though someone, or something, had been repeatedly pulling at it. Mark pushed the shelf, but it did not budge. When he pressed against it a second time, the wood shuddered under his palm as if resisting. He exhaled, stepped back, and turned on his flashlight, sweeping the beam across the room. That was when he saw the footprints. They were small, child-sized, scattered across the floor in erratic patterns. Some were partially smeared, others perfectly crisp, as though freshly imprinted. They led toward the far corner of the room and stopped abruptly at the wall. Mark approached slowly, his breath quickening, and pressed his hand against the wallpaper. It was cold, unnaturally so. The chill crept up his arm in a slow, crawling wave. He marked the location in his recorder, then moved on, trying to steady himself. The deeper he went into the estate, the worse the atmosphere grew. The temperature dropped. His breath puffed visibly in the stale air. Doors creaked behind him even when he hadn't touched them. In the upstairs hallway, he smelled something faintly sweet, almost floral. A moment later he realized the scent matched the dried petals found in Eleanor Ashford's diary, decades before. His pulse hammered, but he pressed forward, determined not to let panic compromise the investigation. When he reached the last room on the third floor, the old nursery, he hesitated before opening the door. Something thumped from inside. Once. Then twice. The sound was soft, almost like the padded footsteps of a running child. Mark swallowed hard, turned the knob, and entered. The nursery was empty. Toys lay scattered on the floor, untouched for decades, coated in grime. A rocking horse sat in the center of the room, motionless. The window on the far wall was cracked open, though he was certain the sheriff's reports had said the house was sealed. He walked toward it, intending to close it, but stopped halfway when the rocking horse began to move. Slowly. Forward, then back. No wind touched it. No vibration shook the floor. It rocked as if someone very small had just climbed off. Mark's flashlight sputtered. The room darkened. And then it came, the whisper. Not from the closet. Not from the hall. Not from behind the walls. It came from right behind his ear. Stay. Mark spun, flashlight trembling. No one was there, yet the air was thick with presence. Heavy. Watching. The recorder in his pocket crackled violently, filling with static and thin childlike giggles layered under a deeper, rasping exhale. His pulse surged. Panic clawed at him. He stumbled toward the door, but it slammed shut before he reached it. Hard. The sound echoed through the house like a falling beam. Something scraped across the floor behind him. He didn't look. He couldn't look. By the time the sheriff arrived hours later, after Mark failed to check in, the house was silent again. No signs of struggle. No footprints. No signs of the young deputy except for his recorder lying on the nursery floor, still running, capturing only the sound of faint breathing, slow, patient, deliberate, as if something had leaned close to the device long after Mark was gone.